Excellent. So I'll just get started. I know that a lot of people will be kind of joining in dribs and drabs there. So first of all, thank you very, very much to our panelists for joining this evening, and for everyone who's now just filtering in, as I can see. First thing to say, if anyone's interested in joining the Young Fabians Communication Network, please get involved. You can contact us on our Twitter. You can just DM us in there. So anyone who's interested in either the media or the communication space, we'd love to hear from you to build up this network as we go forward. So yes, the topic for discussion today, Labour's future communication strategy. So it's as it says on the tin, essentially. What I want this to be, I want it to be a bit more, future facing, as the name suggests. So while I do expect some kind of aspect of looking back to the previous, the Corbyn era, what potentially went wrong communications wise, I do want it to be future facing. And obviously it's, coronavirus rather, has dominated politics, and it probably will, at least the economic impact for the next years to come. But even at that, I do want to focus on some of the more kind of deeper structural issues which Labour faces in the way that it presents itself to the electorate. So joining me today is first of all Johanna Baxter. Thank you very, very much for joining us. She had a lifelong career dedicated around the Labour movement. She has now been elected onto Labour's NEC for the second time, and is also a member of the Scottish NEC. So it's really great to have you. Joining Johanna is Mark. So Mark's going to come from more of a kind of private sector background. He's Chief Executive of Newington Communications, but has also been involved with Labour in the past, working as a campaigns manager. And last but not least, we have Tom Flynn. So Tom Flynn also works at Newington Communications, but he also works as a Labour councillor for Camberwell Green. So again, thank you very much for joining today. So let's kick off. I think first things first, Starmer has been around for about 3 months now. So let's go first, Johanna Baxter. What's your thoughts on what's he doing right, and what do you think he's potentially doing wrong so far?
Well, I think he comes across very well. I think he's been measured, he's been forensic in his analysis of the government and their feelings, particularly around the coronavirus, and he's been very assured, self-assured, and also I think has provided a lot of reassurance to Labour activists. I've been an activist for 23 years, and I see someone's just put in the chat that the repetition of forensic is strange. I mean, I agree, but I do actually think that we need to present ourselves as a responsible, credible opposition, and I think actually his focus on detail and policy and critical analysis is going to be key to that going forward. And I think he's had a really good few months in the role. He's appointed a very credible, competent shadow cabinet. Obviously, he's had the NEC by-elections, and just yesterday, ourselves on the National Executive Committee selected a new General Secretary. So I think it's all changed at the top, and I think there's been a positivity around the party, I think, which has given a lot of people hope for the future.
Yeah, certainly. Let's say devil's advocate here. The government are in chaos. This is obviously a very, very severe crisis, and maybe Starmer hasn't been ultimately too critical so far. Do you think that, for example, I know that he's making progress in opinion polls, etc., but do you think he should be ultimately more aggressive? I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Mark.
Well, I think the key thing is he's got to be true to himself, and he's got to be authentic. I mean, he comes as an expert lawyer, a man who's got a great grasp of the detail, a man who has for years performed in the courtroom. I think you're seeing the strength of that now coming through in PMQs. So I think he's, very much got to be authentic to himself, play to his strengths. And I think that's shining through, and that's a really good contrast to the sort of buffoonery that you see from Boris Johnson. I think in time he needs to, bring clarity to his messaging. I think we need to, he needs to be seen to be credible, particularly on things like the economy, and he needs to develop an agenda that's very aspirational for people. And I think, that's the sort of strategy I'd see him taking forward. And I think he's got a long time to prove himself, so it's a good start.
And do you have any thoughts at all, Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Harry. I was just thinking back to, I did an event for the Young Fabians when I was on the Young Fabians exec many years ago on 100 Days of David Cameron, the first 100 days, and looking at how he had kind of impacted politics in that time. And obviously, Starmer has not been able to make that kind of a level of big bang because of the massive amount of stuff that's going on at the time, but that kind of essential role of politics still holds, that you've got 100 days to impact on the population and what they think of you. And I think Starmer has started well on that front. For a lot of people, they'd not seen him before. They'd not heard of Keir Starmer. And if they had very, very few thoughts on him at all. And what we've seen is, he's hit the government hard when he's needed to. He's kept quiet at other times. And it's a quite smart and considered strategy. As Mark said, he has plenty of time to get his kind of core message across. What people want in that first 100 days is, who is this guy and is he up to it? And what we've seen so far, I'd say, he's not doing too bad. Great quote the other day from one of the lobby who had spoke to a Labour press officer, and they said, "Who are you putting up on the media round this morning?" And they said, "Michael Gove." It's like, yeah, as always, the kind of the classic lines count, which is, in this case, don't get in the way of your enemy when they're completely cocking up. Leave them to it, get out of the way, and come back later. And I think that he doesn't need to be heard all the time to be making an impact right now.
Yeah, well, it's certainly interesting because he basically hasn't been heard from this week, from what I can see. Certainly around the Dominic Cummings issue. I suppose that Boris Johnson might be quite lucky that the fact that there's no PMQs this week. But yeah, does anyone think that he should be more vocal on Dominic Cummings, or do you think, as Tom says, that they need to be, don't interrupt them where they're making a mistake?
I think Tom's right on this. I think the story's running and running and running without Keir wading in to say, "Oh, you've got to resign," because that's what everybody is saying at the moment. So I think there is an element of let them let your opposition fail on their own terms. I think what I would say about his performance in terms of the coronavirus more generally is that I think he's provided a level of reassurance to the public that we're not going to use that pandemic for political purposes, that we will analyse the science around what's happening with the coronavirus, and we will base our challenges on what's best for the country. I think if Keir had just been perceived as somebody who would attack the government at any turn in relation to this, it would have been perceived as political opportunism, and there's no way the party would do that. So I think he's provided a level of reassurance that he will challenge where it's appropriate, and sit back and be guided by the science in other instances.
I find that clearly, to go back to that word forensic that everyone seems to say, that he seems to criticise the government on very, very specific issues. So you'll get Boris Johnson to trip up over himself at PMQs, or for example, when he got him to do the U-turn around NHS staff or immigrant NHS staff having to pay, etc. But I don't know, Mark, do you find that there's maybe a lack of maybe overall vision to Keir Starmer? No one really understands what precisely, even Labour people, precisely what he stands for, and maybe, to the country itself, what does Labour stand for?
It's very, very early days. He's got, it's 4 or 5 years to we have a general election if we serve a full-time term. He'll build up his list of policies. He'll build up his credibility. Party conferences, when they come back, will help him establish a rhetorical speaking style and giving more inspiration and more of his vision. At the moment, it's, as the other two panelists have said, you know, the best people to attack the Tories are the Tories themselves. And when they're doing such a good job of it, you don't want to get involved. So let's just, the Tory backbenchers have their day. And if they're criticising the government, let us just stay out of it. Because as you can see from where the polls are moving, that trust in the Conservative government is disappearing, and it's disappearing quickly. It's a trust that we, you know, and I hate to look back at previous leadership, but it's a trust that we've got to build up again. So at this point, just let the Tories, you know, fail on their own terms. Let's not get involved. At the odd pointer, the odd guiding the journalists to look at the various different stories, that's important, but we shouldn't be really heavily involved in this. Just let the Conservatives fight amongst themselves.
Yeah.
Can I just also say, Harry, I mean, I think one thing about vision is we need to be mindful of the fact that the virus and the pandemic will have fundamentally changed our society, actually. So what we might have thought would have been a good thing policy-wise a few months ago might actually not be right for the future as it looks post-pandemic. We need to, I think what Keir does need to do is, as the country moves into recovery, is start setting out a vision for what changes the virus has brought, which we might want to continue in society: workforce flexibility, the ability for people to work from home so that it enables childcare and allows people to work more flexibly. Those sorts of things we might want to promote more widely post-pandemic, but there may also be other changes which need more focused attention by the party in policy terms coming out of this, in terms of risk, in terms of how we deal with our care sector, for example. And it's those sorts of issues that I think Keir will need to turn his attention to in the weeks and months ahead.
Yeah, interesting. Just to kind of move it just very slightly, in terms of what we're seeing, the attack lines towards Keir Starmer, starting off. Tom, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, but what we're seeing is, well, what I've seen initially is they're trying to, you know, it's quite petty, the Sir Keir, that's been used quite a lot to make him look like a man of the establishment, as it were. What do you think the attack lines will be on Labour going forward, and what do you think Labour should do to kind of blunt them?
I think the first one that starts coming through, I use my mum as a bit of a political barometer sometimes. She's a kind of Essex swing voter who reads the Daily Mail every day from cover to cover. And she told me the other day that she was very disappointed that Keir had been playing politics by criticising the government over the last few days. And what that told me was that is the message that they're kind of seeding out into the right-wing press day after day after day at the moment, that these very legitimate questions that he has are actually attacks during a time when we should be unified as a country. And that's a very effective attack if done well, because it's kind of takes away the focus from the mistakes the government's making. But luckily, and I think Keir has been a very, very lucky politician in a lot of ways, as well as a very skilled one since his kind of trajectory. And sometimes the luck just holds. And yet again now, just as they're kind of trying to make the point that that he's playing politics, it turns out that the government have cocked up in a huge way that is changing public opinion daily. Opinion polls are absolutely crashing and burning for them. So what the Tories will be worried about and looking for right now is how they can change that competence number that's going up for Labour. If the competence number goes up, we'll already outrank them in things like how relevant we are to people's lives, how in touch we are with the public. Those are numbers where Labour scores well. Competence and those sort of areas are the areas where the public tend to worry slightly. We've seen Keir's numbers ticking up. So look for them taking cases out of context from when he was DPP. Look for them talking about his record in shadow cabinet as, first of all, tying him to anything that they think is toxic from the Corbyn era, but also tying him very much to Remain and to the idea of being a politician will try and take us back into the EU when that question has kind of been and gone. So what I would expect, and I say it's coming from the perspective of someone who's worked on digital campaigns on elections for many years, what you will see is those guys, the New Zealand guys that the Tories brought in to do a lot of the attack stuff during the general election. You will see some horrendous stuff going out online from Tory outriders, claims being made. This is a government that builds itself on people like Dominic Cummings, who are prepared to chuck lies, half-truths, and horrendous attack lines that are way below the belt onto Twitter and Facebook and so on, and let them run. So what we really need to be watching for is not just that stuff we can see, not just the stuff that Johnson and others are saying, but the under-the-radar stuff that is kind of hitting the general public on Facebook. And it's up to all of us to be looking out for that and reporting it when we see it, and checking the ads library on Facebook and so on, because we need to spot these attacks and hit them back very, very hard, very quick.
Yeah, we can't. Sorry, I'd like to just share on that. I mean, any criticism he makes at the moment, unless it's very specific, I think will face the charge of being unpatriotic. And as Tom has said, just playing politics. I think that actually plays to his strength, that he has a real ability to, really focus in and point out the error of where people are going. I think with the new General Secretary and the new media team, who are real professionals of what they're doing and really strong campaigners, I think, we've got a real stance to be able to rebut some of the negative stuff quickly. But it's going to need to involve all the membership in communicating when they see stuff coming into their Facebook pages that is incorrect. We don't want to spend our time just talking to each other and arguing internally. We've got to reach out and actually talk to the electorate. We love spending our time talking to each other, to members, but we're not very good at actually talking to the electorate. We really got to get out there with an agenda that's popular and share that with ordinary people and get them to buy in to what it is we're trying to do.
Yeah, I just kind of on that then about kind of reaching out. I've got a few questions as well from the Q&A that has alluded to this. The new team have potentially a bit of a honeymoon period here. Like for example, the Daily Telegraph, I'm sure you all saw when on VE Day, Keir Starmer had an op-ed, and that was on the front page of the Daily Telegraph with pretty solid Labour values on there, but also a real kind of patriotic strand to it. Which is actually, if you think about it, a pretty incredible achievement as in itself. But do you think with maybe like the likes of the Mail and the Telegraph, this is just a honeymoon period, or can Labour ever, put them back in their box, as it were, and make them at least a bit more fair? Johanna, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think we do need to reach out on as many platforms as we can. I'm not sure if there's a thing about a honeymoon period here, but I mean, I think in terms of the attacks that might be thrown at Keir, I agree with Tom about cases being used out of context against him, and particularly the Remain issue, because I think one of the biggest attacks that we're going to face is around splits in the party and the inability to reconcile different parts of the party, because divided parties don't win, and so you will see Conservatives trawling through Labour Party Facebook groups and the like to find examples of where there's division, and I think it takes internal discipline to try to get over that. But I think they'll use the Remain Leave issue against us in that regard. But I think they'll also cite other issues like the response to anti-Semitism and different voices within the party on that, particularly since obviously the EHRC report, an investigation is due to conclude, and that will be a difficult issue for the leadership to deal with. Whatever comes out of that is going to be a difficult issue for the leadership to deal with. I think the other big attack line will be on the economy, because I think coming out of the pandemic, we're going to see an economic recession, the like of which I think we'll never have seen before. And clearly, as a party, we would be arguing for greater investment in the public services that have kept the country running. But that, I suspect, will be used against us. Because there's not going to be much money going around. And I see that somebody's put on the chat that the panel aren't understanding the reality and precarity of many people's lives. But I'd say in my day job, I negotiate on behalf of local government workers all across Scotland. And I absolutely see that on a daily basis. But I do think that the leadership have been standing up for those individuals, not just in terms of safety, but in terms of protecting the workers who are actually keeping the country running at the moment. And I don't think that is an area where Keir has stepped back and let the Conservatives bail on their own terms. I think he's done that with other issues, but on issues of safety and wages, for example, of some of the lowest paid workers in this country in the care sector, he's led the charge. So I think there's a number of issues that he's going to be attacked on, but those in terms of principle and our values, he has to be very strong on, and going into the next election, the economy will be central, and shaping the economy for the future that we want to see, which is investing in the public service and protecting those on the lowest pay and our most vulnerable, I think is going to be where the big debate comes.
I think if I could jump in, I'd just say, I think, you know, coming from, I'm a Scouser originally, and, you know, I remember living through the last recession in the mid-80s in Liverpool and trying to get work. I think post the COVID crisis, it's going to be about jobs. It's going to be about good jobs. It's going to be about future jobs. It's going to be about green jobs. You know, if Labour has an agenda that can deliver new jobs for people, new opportunities for people, that's what's going to cut through with ordinary members of the public. You know, people are going to be concerned about keeping the jobs they've got, but a lot of people are going to be unemployed, and it's going to be about getting them back to work in jobs that are meaningful and long term. And we have a great opportunity with the massive need to hit net zero in terms of environmental, to create a whole new green industry. And we've got to get right behind that and invest in things like onshore wind, solar, etc., and create jobs in that base around that, and with the technology that supports that, and get people into them, get them skilled up, get them trained, and make sure if we have a solid economic programme, then we have a chance of government. If Labour is not trusted on the economy, as has been proven time and time again, it's very difficult for us to get into government. So we really have to narrow those numbers on the economy and be ahead by the time the election comes around.
But talking of the economy, then I think I've seen a comment in as well, and the questions kind of allude to this as well. So we're in a, you know, public spending is rocketed at the moment. We're going to be in a lot of debt, and let's say, I know I don't want to stray too much into policy, etc. here, but classically Labour, as you say, has not been trusted on the economy, and there's an attack line from the Conservatives that it's just going to be spend, when the public finances aren't in a very good state. How does Labour communicate that, first of all, it can be trusted with public finances, but also deliver a kind of compelling vision for the country at the same time? Don't know, Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think as Joe was talking about earlier, you know, the narrative has changed, the world has changed as a result of coronavirus. And, you know, when I talked before about Keir being a bit of a lucky politician, you know, he is potentially the leader of the Labour Party at the moment that public opinion changes on how we perceive society and the safety net and the way in which we take care of people. And, you know, in order to capitalise on that chance, we have to be trusted. We have to be trusted by the electorate to do the right thing. And the Tories will not be able to throw some of the lines that they've thrown around in the past. They've basically spent everything we would have done if we won an election on saving the country during a time of national crisis. And what that's shown people is that when you have to, you can. And so they will be, and let's not forget with Johnson that he changes his politics in order to fit the situation he's in. And the Tories will not be going into the next election talking about austerity and trying to make Labour look like the big spenders. They will be going into that election saying, you can't trust them because they'll all kill each other when they get in. And, you know, the secret agenda is this, that, and the other. It won't be, you know, spend versus don't spend next time. It will be what we spend on. And, you know, they're still using the line again. Today, they're talking again in the briefing earlier and so on about levelling up with the, you know, spending in the north and so on, which as a councillor in one of the most deprived wards in London, to me means levelling down for my residents who are already down. You know, it doesn't mean more money, it means taking money away from those who need it the most. And so we can't let the illusion that they are kind of investing in the most deprived communities stand when it's going to mean taking away from other places that desperately need it as well. And, you know, I think Starmer has this chance, and we have 4 years to make that case. But there are 4 years where the framing is, think back to Brexit, just from a comms point of view. Like after Brexit, getting Brexit done did not mean, you know, crashing out of the EU and having absolutely no trading partnership with our closest neighbours. At the time, it meant perhaps something like Norway. And over that time, they chipped away and chipped away and chipped away at the message and changed the narrative of what Brexit in its purest sense mean. And we have 4 years here, at least, in order to change people's perceptions of what we mean when we talk about fairness and when we talk about equality and when we talk about lifting up the most vulnerable in society. Lots of people have a very different perception of what it means to be a care worker right now than they did 3 months ago or 6 months ago. A very different perception of what it means to be an immigrant worker on low wages than they did before. And we need to capitalise on this moment and use it to sort of push Labour values into the heart of where we go next.
I think, you know, I'd agree totally with the other two panelists, but, you know, we have to demonstrate that we understand how to create wealth as well as how we spend it. And we've got to demonstrate that we know how to make sure that wealth is spread more equally throughout society. I think in the past, we've been very good about, you know, what we spent. I think how much the Conservatives have spent on the coronavirus issue means that we've got that attack line to a certain extent has been taken away, will be weakened when the Tories attack us. But we've got to have a positive agenda. We've got to talk about new jobs. We've got to talk about how we get new jobs, and not just in London and the South East. It's got to spread throughout the whole of the UK. We've got to create new jobs in new industries using the latest technology and latest digital technology in the Northeast, in the Northwest, up here in Scotland, in Wales, in, you know, some of our real deprived communities, that as the focus has focused in and around London and the areas around it, you know, other areas of the country have lost out, and all the stats prove that. And we've also got to invest in local government and allow them to support small businesses in their communities and help them create the employment that we need in order to get the country up and running again.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just to slightly kind of just move on slightly, I've got a really interesting question here. It says, so much of our conversation about communication is based on assumptions. The problem is assumptions can be wrong. How can we actually utilise data, evidence and science to work out which messages cut through and which messages don't? I don't know, does anyone have any kind of thoughts on that or expertise in the field of data and evidence, etc.?
Well, Tom, you're the data expert, mate. So
I was just going to say that as well.
No pressure. No, I totally accept the premise of the question in terms of, from what I've heard, I don't know the new General Secretary of the Labour Party personally. I think I've met him a couple of times, but from what I have heard of his approach at the campaign company that he's run for many years, the elections that they've worked on and the way that they've worked on those elections has involved polling, research and scrupulous analysis of data, one of the biggest mistakes we make in politics is to go on emotion rather than on cold hard fact, and we do this a lot. And there's always been some phenomenal people at Southside who have kind of rolled us back from that and said, you need to look at them, you need to look at this data, you need to realise what the public are thinking and saying. And I think we all kind of sometimes get trapped in the idea that Twitter is the real world, that's how the general public think. And we won't always like what we hear when we trust the data. We are the sort of position that any credible polling at all says that we need to have on immigration is going to be incredibly uncomfortable for everyone in the Labour Party. Now, we can go some of the way to persuading people that they're wrong and we're right on that, but we're going to have to meet them somewhere in the middle. And, you know, rigorous polling, trusting the data, and not kind of sort of looking at it and saying that doesn't fit with our world narrative is absolutely critical. Now, I work in digital campaigns. Yeah, the cold, hard reality of running Facebook ads is that if they do not respond well with people, they crash and burn. And there is nothing you can do to make the message you wanted to get out work if it's not resonating. An example of this, if I may just quickly, a good friend of mine who ran Sadiq's digital campaign back when he won the London Mayoral campaign said that they constantly put out ads talking about their policy on housing, and they just crashed every time, and they never ever got the responses that they wanted. And every time they did something on the Hopper Fair, it just went through the roof. And so they had a look and they said, well, actually our housing policy is really, really complex and really, really hard to boil down to a couple of points on a Facebook graphic, whereas the idea that you can get on 2 buses in an hour is very simple. So in that regard, the policy on housing didn't change, but the communication was, you know, moved on to something that was popular and easy to communicate. And as a result, they did very well digitally in that election, as well as like winning.
I think if I could just say, I mean, messaging is going to be really important. We're going to have to spend a lot of time making sure we've got the right messaging, that it's consistent, that all the front bench are not saying the same thing, but they're all speaking from the same hymn sheet, emphasizing how that different messaging flows through all their departments. But backing that up, as Tom said, we need to have evidence that proves that what we're saying is just not what we want, what we aspire to, but it's actually proven to work. And we've got to make sure that as we go forward, whenever we're putting messaging forward, we've got the evidence to back that up, because that's the only way we'll win the confidence of people, particularly those who are becoming so skeptical now due to the amount of false news that's around, the amount of personal opinion that's passing on Twitter, on Facebook, dressed up as news, which isn't news. We've really got to make sure that everything we say, we can evidence and we can communicate that to the people who are, you know, ultimately are going to be the people who make the decision on whether we're a government or not.
So talking of social media, etc., the kind of cesspit that Twitter is, I know the Corbyn leadership relied very heavily, rather than trying to maybe influence, maybe like the Telegraph, for example, they relied very heavily on social media, and the likes of like so-called outriders, Novara Media, kind of commentators being the best known of them. Do you think under the new leadership there's a role for that kind of social media, quite aggressive, putting the point across, or should Labour's new communication strategy on social media be a lot less maybe aggressive as it was? So Johanna, if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think social media has its place, and obviously it reaches a particular type of person, and there's no communication strategy in which social media doesn't have a role. Of course it does, and it has to be alongside other mediums. We have to use all mediums. But we also have to look at where our voters are, what mediums they access on a more regular basis, and make sure that those are the ones that we are targeting. In terms of the social media outriders, I I don't necessarily think that some of the previous leadership's outriders were very helpful to them, particularly because there was certainly a lot of misinformation in some of those forums, and so I don't think they necessarily helped the previous leader, and I certainly wouldn't want Keir to replicate some of those errors. I think the party has to ensure that we do, as Tom had said, look at what the data is telling us, and target our media, frame our media message around that. But message discipline is going to be very, very important as well. That's one thing that Conservatives are very good at. It's one thing the SNP are, up here in Scotland are very, very good at. And the party has, our party has not always been great at that. And we need to be better at it. So I don't necessarily think Keir setting up his own outriders, which may not be the same outriders as the previous leadership had, is going to help that, to be honest. But clearly, social media has a role to play. We need to be better at it. The Conservatives clearly have pushed a lot of money into that, and they're very good at finding out picking the best slots, I think, is how I'd term it, and we need to be better at that. But I don't think that means that we can't do all the other things as well, broadsheets and red tops and all the rest of it. We have to have the full package.
I think, just to build on what Johanna's saying, you know, we've got to appeal to all the communications channels. So whether they're, you know, if it's a good story, then even the Mail and the Express will run it as a good story. They might tweak it to, you know, show the Conservatives up better. But if it's a good story, even the Blue Tops will run it. But we've got to think of things like not just what we're doing online, which I think, you know, we've got some great people who can drive that agenda. But we've got things like, are we getting the right people on ITN News for the 6 o'clock news bulletin that the people who are at home at that time are watching and have got a very clear understanding of who their viewers are? Are we talking to the local papers, who are, you know, probably the most trusted of all the communication vehicles that we've got? Are we appearing as reasonable, sensible people who have the interests of our community at heart when we are representing the Labour Party on community forums, online and things like that? All these different communications channels, we've got to present the Labour Party as being on the side of working people and ordinary people, but also with an aspirational agenda that says that, you know, it's tough now, but working with us, it will be a fairer future, and you've got a better living for yourselves and your future generations.
So talking of using all kind of communications channels, you know, the main one, the big behemoth, the BBC, and in the last election, or again under to the last leadership, there was a bit of a kind of fraught relationship there. I remember at one point, talking of social media and outriders, etc., they had hashtag sack Laura Kuenssberg trending, for example. Is the BBC a natural ally of Labour? Should Labour be doing more to kind of reach out to them? Or is you know, for example, what I should be saying is, do you think the BBC have been biased against Labour, or do you think the BBC are generally quite fair? So, Tom, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I worked for the party on the referendum, and I was there the first time Laura Kuenssberg was booed by a Labour audience when she asked a question after a Jeremy Corbyn speech during the referendum, and it seemed quite shocking then. It was quite early on in terms of that level of animosity towards the BBC, and it's sad that it's now kind of commonplace for that to happen. But, you know, I think the BBC do the best job that they can do, and I think they get it wrong sometimes. I think the referendum was one of those times. They didn't really know how to handle Labour and the Tory leadership being on the same side, and what that meant for who got broadcast coverage and so on. I think that if you look the other day at the kind of Kuenssberg row, you know, you've only got to go on to the next couple of tweets that she sent to realise she's reporting verbatim what she was told. And that as a result of you know, people reporting verbatim what they were told by Dominic Cummings, they were able to catch him out a day later, and that is good journalism at the end of the day. I think that it says a lot that people, if you go through Twitter, you'll find people from the far right to the far left, and they all think that the BBC is biased against them specifically. And the day that that changes for any group on the spectrum of politics at all, is the day the BBC is failing and is kind of, projecting a particular view. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't get it wrong on occasions. They are ultimately the kind of middle-of-the-road state broadcaster, so they're never going to be particularly radical or exciting. But that's not what I look for from the BBC. And when I see some of the outriders who used to criticise them, these people have a financial interest in the BBC failing. If you are the owner of Novara Media or Squawk Box, right the way through to the kind of, Guido Fawkes sites and so on, right? The BBC gets more traffic than you do, and that takes ad revenue away from you and means that your place in the media is smaller. Now, I was running a campaign last week with St Paul's Cathedral on their sort of COVID remembrance memorial, and the biggest referrer of traffic other than Facebook was the BBC. By far and away the biggest referrer. 3.7 million people watched Dominic Cummings trip himself up live on TV on Sunday on the BBC. Yeah, we cannot and must not assume that the BBC is hostile to us. We will get difficult questions from journalists, but from a digital perspective, I'm looking for the big hits online. One BBC story that they tweet about us is worth 100 Navaras, if not more than that. And so in terms of, if we get the story right, if it's framed in a way we like, and it won't always be, but sometimes it will, we get more mainstream coverage and to more voters who we need at the next election than we will with any number of media outriders. Twitter is ultimately Labour people shouting at Labour people. There is no value whatsoever to Twitter in politics beyond the activist base and the journalist world. It sets the agenda because journalists read it and think it's the real world. It allows us to either row with each other or come together as Labour activists and kind of celebrate what we do on the doorstep and so on. But it has no value whatsoever in changing the minds of an electorate. None, like zero.
Oh.
Can I just add to that as well? I mean, I think Tom is absolutely right when he says that if either the left, the right think that the BBC is their ally, is the day that the BBC has failed, because BEEB is a public service broadcaster. And I have to say, a country without the quality of content that the BBC produce, if we don't have that, we will have failed the nation, because we cannot view the BBC purely through a prism of whether or not they benefit our party politically, because you just look at how they've responded to the coronavirus to see the depths of the service to the public that they are delivering in terms of educational content, in terms of recreational content, interaction, newsworthiness, all of that. And that's before we even come on to David Attenborough. So I can always manage to squeeze him in somewhere. What I'm saying is, viewing the BBC through the prism of how they personally further our party's agenda is like viewing the NHS through the prism of personally how it benefits our party's agenda. Neither of those institutions should be treated like that. And I think Tom is absolutely right when he says, they won't always get it right, but the service that they provide to our nation is much greater than, the 6 o'clock news that happened to broadcast yesterday or the day before. Laura Kuenssberg did not lose Labour the general election. I mean, let's put it as starkly as that. And the fortunes of the BBC should not solely rest on Laura Kuenssberg's performance. It is a much broader, wider public service and valuable institution to this country than just that.
Just very, very briefly, some of the highest journalistic standards in the world, I think, exist in the BBC. I think it does need to keep modernising and keep up with the world as the modern world. But you know, if it's not pissing us off because they've asked us a question we don't want to answer, then they're probably not doing their job. And it's you know, it's great that we have a press that's like that, that is still values hard news, evidence-based questioning. You know, if we lose that, we're in real trouble.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So 2 thumbs up for the BBC from the panelists. I'd like to just kind of move on slightly a bit further. The general election result was obviously a very, very bad one, and Labour made massive losses in the north of England. Now, there are 2 kind of issues I'd like to explore around that, around basically Labour's new heartland is, or new kind of base is, young, educated, urban people, essentially, and I imagine most of the listeners here will, you know, be in that kind of category. How does Labour, for example, communicate over issues, let's say, of patriotism without losing their kind of liberal, young kind of base? Obviously, within that, there's issues around immigration and Brexit, etc. Johanna, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, I mean, I really think we didn't speak to our base. Working class people, I think, have lost faith, a lot of faith in the party to represent their interests. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. And I think very few of them relate to patriotism, actually. And you might think that's strange to say as a Scot, particularly given the independence debate that exists up here. But I do suspect that particularly the approach to Brexit, the approach to independence, etc., have similarities in terms of the reasons behind them. And a lot of that relates to the disconnection with working class people. And I mean, I don't think it's right to say that our base now is young, educated, elite. It doesn't have to be that way. I think we need to be very authentic in our messages. I think we have to ensure that they're grounded in people's reality. And I think we'll get a lot further if we do that. And that's about less about patriotism and more about understanding people's needs. And I say that as a, you know, I've been a trade union official for over 20 years. I have members who are, you know, earning the living wage, and some who are on the minimum wage, who, you know, can't afford sometimes the bus fare to come to our trade union offices to have a discussion about the issues that they're facing, and so we go to them, and that's the reality of people's lives. It's very, very challenging, and the party has to be grounded in that reality in a way which is not patronising, which is not people who are well off telling people who aren't well off how they should be living their lives. It's about genuinely reflecting the issues that working class people are experiencing on a daily basis, and the challenges that have been posed to them through decades of austerity, and the undervaluing of jobs that we all now, particularly through the pandemic, realise we cannot as a society do without. So I think it's about us being better connected with our communities, and not in some kind of patronising, community organising way where we tell people how they should organise. It's about genuinely being involved in our communities ourselves, and therefore understanding issues because we're part of responding to them in our own communities. I'm not sure if I've described that in the best way, but hopefully you get my meaning.
No, I get what you mean, but so for example, let's take specifically immigration. This is obviously a very, very tricky subject, especially in Labour. And I believe Keir Starmer committed, obviously whether or not this happens, to freedom of movement if Labour were to win the next election. Do you not find that that could be it's a tricky, thing for Labour to navigate in terms of messaging? How does Labour talk about immigration in a positive way, but then again, in these big Labour heartland seats that they got lost and voted Brexit, that potentially the reason was part of that was around immigration. Mark, do you have any thoughts about how Labour could navigate that kind of complex subject?
A lot of this is the fear of immigration and concerns that what people have are going to be lost because there's not going to be enough to go around. We need to make sure that people have secure jobs, see their kids going to good schools, make sure there's a good health service, champion all that's good about the UK. And then if we do that effectively, then the issue of immigration becomes less of an issue. There's lots of jobs in London and the South East. Not surprisingly, London particularly, immigration isn't that big an issue. But if you go up north where there aren't jobs, where people are really struggling to, pay their bills at the end of the week, then immigration is a huge issue because people are feared about losing what they've got and they fear for their children. So we've got to have some sort of inspirational message. We've got to talk about how, that we're going to help the next generation be better than this generation. We've got to talk about how we're going to create jobs, how we're going to skill up UK workers in order to take the jobs that need to be done in the next generation. And we've got to talk about how we're going to invest in schools and make sure that we've got a fair education system where everyone has equality of opportunity. I mean, I went to a comprehensive school in Liverpool and I had no idea what the city was until I first came down to London. I got to about 18, I got A-levels in economics and maths, etc. But no one had told me what the city was. No one had explained that to me. It is something that, if you're not connected to the city or you're not involved in that, you have no understanding. We've got to make sure the opportunities that exist in the UK are spread fairly throughout society to all types, all peoples, all sexes, whatever educational background we've got. And we've got to push back against the Tories who, succeed, they educate their kids in, private school, and then they pull up the ladder. We've got to make sure that equality of opportunity has to be fundamental message that we get out of that. And if we do that, then immigration becomes less of an issue for us.
So I've got another question here, just kind of in line with this. So Labour is very good at speaking to values of justice, equality and fairness, but it needs to speak to a broader range of values to attract a wider electorate. How can Labour speak to more values such as prosperity, security, freedom without compromising on our own ideas? So it's quite similar to what's already just been discussed, but Tom, do you have any thoughts on that?
So, we talked about the red wall at the start of this, so just wanted to, because I think this is a fundamental point, and I'm going to come at this from, a digital comms perspective. Ultimately, my role in life is I'm a salesman, yeah? Someone gives me the messaging, I will go and put it in the right place and sell it in the right way and tweak the wording and make sure that it fits. That's kind of the way I approach these things. And what I see when I see the red wall is, so think back to last summer, it was around June last year, James Kanagasorian, the pollster, coins the phrase the red wall. And what it didn't mean a series of seats that could go Tory or would go Tory if the Tories got a big majority. It was a very, very specific thing culturally that was going on there. And he said, if you're a plumber in a seat in the red wall who earns a certain amount of money and lives in a certain type of house and faces the same problems as a plumber in Portsmouth, that plumber in Portsmouth, in an election that the Conservatives win, votes Tory. But the one in the northern seat votes Labour anyway, out of a kind of cultural loyalty to the Labour Party that has existed even when, logically, they should have switched. And what he was getting at was that once you break that bond, it's gone. Once people make that step once, it's over. There is no kind of cultural loyalty to voting Labour anymore, which means that we're not just kind of trying to tease back natural Labour voters. We now have to win them entirely all over again. Now, some of them will be feeling a bit of kind of buyer's remorse about what they've done in voting for, Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party at this stage. Others actually are probably quite happy with their choice and feel that, they've made the jump now, and that they'll kind of vote the way that their mind tells them to, rather than a kind of pressure from family and friends that they've had in the past. So we have to approach how we tackle the red wall. Every single one of those people is now a swing voter. They're no longer in the bank for us anymore. And therefore, we need to earn their trust in the way that Joe was talking about, by being right in their communities. Now, but when it comes to digital campaigning in those communities, unfortunately, and apologies now if the Young Fabians is very, very different from the years I was on the exec, but if it is anything like the time 15 years ago that I was a member of your exec, then not many people, if any, on this call have the reach into those seats at all, and the credibility in them in order to share those messages. And the way we share messages online, with impact, is that, Harry, you share something on Facebook and I see it and I think, well, I think Harry's a really interesting guy and he's really smart, and therefore, because he's saying this thing about the Labour Party, I'm gonna kind of go with that and at least have a look at what he's saying and be open to that suggestion. Now, if I'm someone who feels left behind, who the Labour Party has kind of abandoned over time, and I'm only seeing people who are kind of London liberals, people who don't understand my life, don't understand my community, telling me why I should vote Labour, I'm gonna recoil from that, and a massive part of the effort we need to make is, how do we find those authentic social media voices that resonate in those communities? Because it doesn't cut, and the mistake we've made over the last few years, like there's a lot of admirable stuff in the way that the party has done digital campaigning during the Corbyn years. But those kind of very, very slick and very well produced momentum videos, quite often, and some of the stuff the Labour Party did itself, just absolutely hit a wall in these places because it did not resonate with the lives of the people that we were trying to get to. And we have to kind of take that content creation away from the centre. I don't care who's in power. It's not for Westminster and Southside to be doing that. It is for those people in those constituencies. We need to upskill them, teach them how to make content themselves, and let them talk to their communities. Because if we don't do that, we're wasting our time.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I know what you mean about the really slick videos, etc., from Momentum, and some very almost, the messaging can be quite almost sanctimonious. If you're not on our side, then you're evil, which I can't imagine wins the floating voter. The last kind of issue.
Could I just say one thing on that, just very briefly? It's that, one thing we've been very poor at is talking to business, whether it's big business or small business across the country. I was on the call earlier with SME for Labour. There's millions of small business people that are really suffering. Now, we've got to generate a narrative. We've got to accept that small businesses need to make profits in order to employ people, to create employment. We've really got to look hard at the business, at employment, and we've got to come up with a message that says, look, you can trust the Labour Party to deliver, whether that's small business or big business. And we've got to come equally as hard on those multinational businesses that aren't paying their taxes in the UK. That's the balance of that. We've got to be really tough on them, but we've got to have an agenda and a message that says to small business, who are central to most of the communities that we need to reach, that we're behind them. And it's not something I think Labour have done well in the past. Sorry, over to you, Harry.
That's great. Thank you very much. So just the last kind of issue that I want to kind of address is Scotland. So an issue close to my heart. Basically, since the referendum in 2014, as I'm sure everyone will know, Labour has been pretty much wiped out in Scotland, and it's been in kind of between a rock and a hard place in the sense that there is the proper, you know, what's seen as, you know, hardcore unionism, which is the Conservative and Unionist Party, and then you've got the SNP, which wants to stick two fingers up at the establishment, etc. And Labour haven't really found their voice in there. Johanna, what should Labour do in this situation? Because, for example, John McDonnell went up to the Edinburgh Fringe and said, "Oh, Labour might back a second referendum," which was a bit tricky. So yeah, what should Labour do? Should Labour be more staunchly unionist, or should Labour, you know, be more open to the issue of independence?
Okay, that's a big question, I suspect we don't have quite enough time for it, but it's an issue I'm very passionate about. So I was born and brought up in the west of Scotland, in a CLP that at the time I joined, many years ago, was one of the largest membership constituencies in the whole of the UK. Actually, second only to Sedgefield at the time, membership in Scotland across the board has plummeted over that time, and there are many reasons for that. So there is no one silver bullet for the Scottish Labour Party, but there are a number of things that I think we need to do. We need to provide clarity on the union. I have very clear personal views about that. I think we should defend the United Kingdom, and the reason I think that is because it is about our values. It says it on the back of our membership card: we achieve more together than we do apart, by the strength of our common endeavour. For the reasons I joined the Labour Party, I could never support independence, ever, because going it alone is against everything that we as members stand for, in my view. I think, so clarity on the Constitution has to be provided. I think there has been equivocation over that. And certainly I don't think that John McDonnell's intervention was at all helpful. But there has been equivocation within the Scottish Party as well, and there cannot be that. So we need a clear position on that we can communicate to the electorate. And I think it should be to protect the United Kingdom. I think until we have clarity on that, we do not earn the right to be heard. The decline in Scotland was, there was a number of reasons for that. We had not invested in those seats, both in terms of time and effort with the electorate, and our membership bases. We let people drift. We didn't communicate our achievements and successes for those communities when we were in power. And, you know, I think as opposed to the rest of the United Kingdom, there was an alternative. And the SNP are very good at messaging. And so, and one of the things that frustrates me no end is seeing colleagues in the party who are outside of Scotland saying, isn't Nicola Sturgeon great? Because, you know, she must be so left-wing and she's so socialist, and why can't we have her in England? It drives me nuts, because it is a front, but they're very good at presenting. But the facts and the realities are very, very different from that. And I'd say, I'd give you a number of examples for that. So you take local government as an example. Local government has been absolutely decimated in Scotland by the SNP. Since 2013 to 2019, the local government settlement has dropped by 7%. And at the same time, the Scottish Government's grant from Westminster has only dropped 2%. There has been very specific underfunding of local government in Scotland. And at the same time, the Scottish Government have basically ring-fenced local authority spending for their own priorities. So local authorities have less ability to determine what they spend their money on, and there's much less of it. So the cuts are always falling on the same places disproportionately. And that's been a very strategic decision by the Scottish Government. They can say, look, you know, local authorities are responsible for that, it's nothing to do with us, and the local authorities get the blame for any cuts that they're having to impose based on the funding that they do and do not get. A couple of other things. So during the COVID crisis, there were particular concerns about protective equipment being supplied to local government workers. And there was guidance put out on a 4-nation basis by the Chief Nursing Officer, and that was supposed to be implemented in all 4 nations. Because of the concerns about supply, we suddenly find in Scotland that guidance has been changed by the Chief Nursing Officer in Scotland to basically downgrade the protective equipment that our members would have had access to under the 4-nation guidance. And that was simply because they were having supply issues. So rather than fixing the supply issues, they changed the guidance to put local government workers more at risk than their counterparts in the rest of the United Kingdom. It took local government unions, COSLA, the Deputy First Minister, the Cabinet Secretary for Health, the Cabinet Secretary for Local Government, on a call to thrash that out and have that additional note revoked so that local government workers had the same protection as their counterparts in the rest of the UK. The UK government announced additional monies for local government to deal with the COVID crisis. That was supposed to result in £155 million being given to local authorities in Scotland to help them with the COVID crisis. That was announced well over a month ago. That money is still not found its way into local authorities' bank accounts in Scotland, whilst they are absolutely crippled in terms of the financial pressures that the pandemic has brought, never mind the financial gap that they faced before COVID and the additional gap that they're going to face when Brexit hits. So there are many, many examples in Scotland of where the Scottish Government have prioritised a flag over people's rights and protections. And that is deeply, deeply unacceptable and against all the values that I joined this party for. There's no way I will ever support independence, not just for those reasons, but the principal reasons. So the Scottish Labour Party have a massive job of work to do, and I don't think it's about being aggressive to the SNP. I think it's about earning the right to be heard, mobilising in constituencies, being part of our communities, being representative, and providing clear solutions to people. You know, I mean, we need to set out a vision for Scotland that is a fairer vision, that reflects our values, because actually I have to say there are people that are voting Conservative in Scotland that are not doing that because they are Tory voters naturally. They're doing it because they don't feel that they have a home at the moment. And there are people voting SNP who do not believe in independence, but do believe in workers' rights and fairness and equality within our nation. So the SNP are very good at projecting a nice, fluffy public image. The reality is very far from that. And any party that prioritises a flag over people's welfare and rights, I think is well, I would never vote for them.
No, agreed. This is pretty much exactly what I think. I just find it's quite difficult it's difficult, isn't it, for Labour to communicate. For example, Brexit, you know, when you've got the Union Jack flag there and you've got issues of patriotism, when you're trying to convey a more nuanced message, it's very, very difficult. Mark, do you have any thoughts on how Labour should position itself in Scotland?
Well, just, you know, first thing, we've got to be very clearly part of the union. Any doubt on that, we spend the whole election arguing whether we should be or we shouldn't be. And it stops us talking about the issues that are important to real people. So the issues that are important to real people is the failure of the SNP to create get the economy going in Scotland. It's a failure of the Scottish education system that's falling behind the rest of the UK. It's the failure of investment in the National Health Service. All these three things, three critical areas that Labour should be doing well on. And we don't get a chance to speak about it because all people want to hear is, are we pro or anti-independence? So we've got to kill that. We've got to say, you know, in the next elections next year, we're a pro-union party, full stop. We want to talk about the economy. We want to talk about jobs for people. We want to talk about investing in those people who went to work as care workers during the crisis when, you know, nobody else was doing that and putting their lives on the front line. So for me, that's how we communicate. I think we need a clear agenda, a clear pro-jobs agenda again for Scotland that I think we need to get out there. We need to be more challenging. I've got to be honest, the Scottish press is incredibly uncritical of the SNP government. You know, it's very much like a local press that I see in, you know, the Southwark News, because I was a councillor for 12 years alongside Tom. You know, they're very, it's a small press, and it's got to be more critical. It's got to hold the government to account. And whether it's independence or not, that this government has failed. It's been in power for 12 years, and there's hardly ever any critical analysis of its performance. So we've got to encourage the media. We've got to be doing the challenging. And probably, if I'm honest, we probably need a new leader, because we've got Keir in UK. I've got to say, Richard Leonard, a quiet-spoken Englishman, is probably not the best person to be championing us up in Scotland. So, and I say that as an Englishman myself.
Say it's just because of Englishman.
Sorry, can I just come back as well? Just a very quick point before Tom comes in. I do think there is an issue about ensuring that our politicians in the party outside of Scotland do understand Scottish issues if they're being asked on things like question time. I mean, they need to read their brief if they don't already know about Scotland. And the reason I say that is because, you know, any advantage at all that our party provides to the SNP in terms of not understanding what's going on up here, or what the Scottish Party's policy position on particular issues is, just hands them ammunition against the Scottish Labour Party. And we've sadly seen that time and again. So I have said to Keir personally, politicians in the PLP, in local government, in other parts of the United Kingdom, have to understand that devolution is not something that's just happening over there to somebody else that they don't need to pay attention to. They do need to understand that our structures as a party need to catch up with that. And if any of them are coming north of the border or on a show that an SNP politician is on, they need to make sure that they are accurately reflecting the policy position of the Scottish Labour Party. And it wouldn't do any harm for some of them to come and campaign up here to find out, like, on the ground, what things are really like. There's a very vast difference, and I also lived in Southwark for a number of years, but there's a very, very big difference between a constituency Labour Party in the middle of London that has a very high membership, that you can walk from one end of to the other within the space of an hour, than the constituency that I currently chair in the west of Scotland, where we have 2 islands in our constituency. And if you want to go campaigning on Arran, you get a boat for an hour and you lug your leaflets with you. So you know, organisationally, it's a different place. Politically, it's a different place. And there needs to be a better shared understanding across the party about that.
Really interesting. Tom, any final thoughts?
Just a very quick one. I'm going to stick to digital campaigning because my, My knowledge of Scottish politics comes from people like Joe and former MPs like Gemma Doyle and Pamela Nash, who are good friends of mine, telling me what it's like up there and making the case that Joe just made. But in terms of digital organisation, I was asked to have a quick look at a campaign up in Scotland a couple of years ago when there was a kind of high-profile race going on up there, and I was surprised by how under-resourced it was, and the chance of doing what I kind of take for granted in my job was very limited. And I don't think that's down to a lack of talent in Scottish Labour or a lack of ambition to do it. I think it's resourcing. I think it comes from being treated like effectively a branch office of Southside for many years without proper resources to run. And if you know, there's enough talent in Scottish Labour that if they're given the proper tools to do digital campaigning, they can match the SNP. The Nats are very good and have been for a long time on this, and we'll never ever catch them up electorally unless we catch them up digitally.
That's really interesting. Well, thank you very much, guys. I believe we've been talking for about an hour and 20 minutes, so I won't keep you much longer. I've had this question, it came up a few times here, and I thought it's quite a nice one to end on. I don't mean to just catch you out with this, but someone's asked here, can a panelist recommend a book on communications they think people should read? I know it's a tricky one.
It's not specifically about communications, but Charles Handy's Understanding Voluntary Organisations will give you a really good idea of how organisations work and communicate. And that for me, when I started, and the company I built now is part of a group of, which I think is about the 26th biggest PR company in the world. You know, so there must have been a bit of knowledge in there. But, you know, Charles Handy, what he doesn't know about running things and how operations work isn't worth knowing. He is a really great guy. Otherwise, Paul Richards on how to win an election and how to communicate. Paul Richards is one of the best Labour communicators out there. So there's probably two I kick off with to start.
Nice. Any other recommendation, guys?
Yeah, I've got a couple. The first one is a sort of more rounded political comms book, but it gives you the best and the worst of the later New Labour years, which is Damien McBride's autobiography. Is funny and horrifying in equal measure, but you'll learn a lot about how spin doctors used to operate and very much still do. And then on the digital side, if you want just a bit of insight into how digital has affected elections over the last few years, there's a book called Democracy Hacked. It's by an academic based in London called Martin Moore. It's a phenomenal read about some of the dirty tricks and ways in which elections have been manipulated and how politics has been subverted at times by digital. It tells us, you know, what we're up against, because quite often we're up against people who will do things that you know, good, decent campaigning people like us will not do, and we need to know what those tactics are and how we counter them. So that's a really, really good kind of intro to the sometimes terrifying world of digital campaigning.
Excellent, thanks very much. Anything to add, Johanna?
I guess so. I'm not a trained comms person. I'm an activist, so I guess I would pick something that inspired me to speak out. So Helen Lewis's Difficult Women is probably one that I would recommend.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I appreciate that's a tricky question to get you know, to put in front of you. Look, I really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you very much. It was a really interesting conversation, and everyone listening, yeah, thanks very much for tuning in. As I said at the start, if anyone wants to get involved, the Young Fabians Communication Network, you know where to find us on Twitter. So once again, thanks for joining us, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.